Hi everyone, my name is Sierra Burris and we're going to be talking about decision making and problem solving in chapter 8. So let's go to our first slide, which is the chapter outline and what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to be discussing decision making and problem solving and how the two are different. We're going to be talking about the rational approach in decision making. We're going to identify the behavior aspects in decision making. We're going to talk about group decision making, and last but not least, we're going to discuss creativity in decision making and problem solving and how the two relate. So let's move on. Decision making, as the book defines it, as choosing one alternative from among several. So we make decisions typically every day. Recently I made my biggest decision making decision since a very long time, I would have to say, and it's not that big. It's just choosing a different apartment to live in. My old lease was up, so I had to sign a new one. I didn't want to stay at my old apartment complex, so I began to search and look for apartment complexes online. I found a few that was very interesting to me. I toured them and I seemed to like all of them. But I had to come to the conclusion to just choose one, of course. So I started looking at the alternatives, as our book would describe them. I started looking at the amenities of each apartment complex, the difference in the cost of rent, the location of the apartment complexes, how long each one would take me to get to and from work. So I took all of those into consideration and I broke it down and I decided on choosing one apartment. So I, of course, ran into a problem with my decision. All decisions, some decisions don't have problems, but some do. Mine did. So I had to solve this problem. And the textbook describes problem solving as finding the answer to the question. So long story short, we had a balance at our previous apartment complex. So the question was, pay the balance or don't pay the balance and not have anywhere to live. So of course I chose to pay the balance of the apartment complex so that I could sign my new lease. And sometimes in problem solving, the question is like there. It's just a question like either you do it or you don't. And that was the situation that I was in. But I want you guys to note that sometimes in decision making and problem solving, they start off alike, but sometimes, well, eventually they'll end up in a different path from each other. So let's go on to our next slide. So what do we call people who make decisions? Decision makers, of course. And the decision maker chooses alternatives based on his or her evaluation. So every day we make a decision before coming to work. We simply decide what are we gonna wear, what are we not gonna wear, what are we gonna eat that morning, which route we're gonna take to work. All these different things that we're trying to decide right when we wake up in the morning that sometimes we don't even notice that we're doing. So let's go on to our next slide. Next, we're going to talk about the different types of decisions. And not much time is spent on these decisions. We have your programmed decisions, which occurs often enough for decision rules to be developed. And I broke this definition down to being straightforward decisions, basically. But this definition kind of mentions this thing called decision rules. So what is decision rule? It tells decision makers which alternative to choose once they have predetermined information about the decision situation. So our next decision that we have is the non-programmed decision. And This decision, it reoccurs infrequently and for which there is no previously established rule. And non-programmed decisions usually take a little bit longer to answer. So for example, I'll give you a simple example. You're at an Italian restaurant. You don't know how to read Italian, but the menu is all Italian. So it's just going to take you a little longer to figure out what you want to eat in that moment than if you were at a restaurant that if you spoke English, you would be able to read a little faster and decide which entree you want to eat. So let's go to our next slide. In decision making, we make decision making conditions. So we have first the condition of certainty, where this is where the decision maker has the information to make a decision. And then next we have the condition of risk. And this is where the decision maker cannot know for certain what the outcome of the decision will be. But they have enough information to estimate the possibilities of the end result of the decision. And lastly, we have the condition of uncertainty. And this is where the decision maker has no idea of the information that they can predict the end result of the decision. So let's go to our next slide. Now we're going to discuss the rational approach to decision making. And this process is often suggested as a way the decision should be made. And it's broken down into some steps. So in this process, it is in the business world, we assume that managers follow a step-by-step process and the organization is dedicated to making logical decisions. So let's take a look at these steps. So in your first step, you have you have your statement of the situational goal, which simply is a goal for whatever the situation is. Step 2, we identify the problem. And the textbook defines this as gathering information for the goal. So let's go to step 3. And this is to determine the decision type. Remember I said there's 2 decision types to choose from. So here we're going to have a split at this point. And if you choose to go the program decision route, then we will apply the decision rule. And if you go the non-program decision route, then the next step is to generate all your possible alternatives. And then you will evaluate the best possible alternative for the situation. And this step can usually be simple or one that can be a poor decision if the right choices are not made. So we have your 4th step, and that is choosing an alternative with the highest possible payoff. So in our 5th step, we're going to implement the plan. And this is where we put our decision into action. And last, in our final step, we are going to have control. Here, you want the outcomes of the decision to compare and measure to the desired goal. Sometimes you may have to adjust a few things here and there to make sure that the decision is the best decision for what is going on. So let's take a breath. As you can tell, I'm a little tired. Who knew it was so many ways to make a decision? So let's go to our next slide. So now we're going to talk about the behavior approach to decision making. Here is where we acknowledge the role and importance of human behavior in decision making. So how many of us had a time frame on making decisions or even multiple decisions? And this is called the bonded rationality. So inbound rationality is the idea that although individuals may look for the best solution to a problem, sometimes processing all the information, possible solutions, and choosing the best solution is beyond their capabilities. And this is where we go through the administrative model, which is characterized using procedure and rules of thumb. So during this step in the model, uncertainty decision can be reduced. The next step consists of sub-optimizing, which is accepting less than the possible outcome. Last on this model, we recognize satisficing. I know many of us has done this when we're deciding. I know I have. This is when you examine your alternative to only select the one that meets the minimum requirements. We don't want to put in too much effort at all when making those decisions. We all sometimes don't want to admit it, but this is how most decisions are made. And this model kind of categorizes some of us in it if we're a little lazy. And with decision making, sometimes it's going to involve our political views, our intuitions, our commitment, our ethics play a role in the decisions that we make. It's just how we think, how you think as an individual, that can sometimes affect decisions and the way that the outcome may be. So let's move on to our next slide. And sometimes we're required to work in groups when making decisions. So with groups, of course, we have many attitudes and many opinions that's going to occur. And we call this group polarization, which occurs when the average of the group members post discussions tends to be more extreme than the average pre-discussion attitudes. So that's saying in a decision, sometimes you're in your discussion towards the end is a lot different than what you thought was going to happen when you first began. So how many of us have been so deep in a group conversation that we unknowingly come to a decision? Sometimes that decision may not be the best way to go, but this is referred to as group thinking. And sometimes we know working in a group may result in a lack of participation and group problem solving as well. So let's go to our next slide. Finally, we're going to discuss creativity. And with this process, many of us think that it happens at the spark of a moment with our creativity, but that's not the case. There's a breakdown in the way that our brains operate. The first step is preparation. And the preparation stage usually consists of formal training and education. And of course, our minds need a little time to bake the information from the training that we have just learned. So the next step is going to be incubating. I learned this my freshman year of college. My professor used to be like, okay, you guys, incubate. And that used to be the funniest thing. And she would just want us to process everything that we're learning just so that we can have a fresh mind a little bit and our thoughts are not scattered everywhere. And our last step with creativity is verification, which is the test of the truthfulness. So that is what we get from this lesson. We learned that decision making is the process of choosing one alternative from among several, and that problem solving is finding an answer to a question. We also learned that there are two different types of decisions, programmed and non-programmed. And we also discussed the models that help us guide through decision making, group decision making, and creativity. So my question to you guys is, in the business world and our careers, describe a time where you had to make an important decision and what was the result of that decision. It was nice talking to you guys and teaching you guys about decision making. It's a lot of information, but thanks for listening.